Hello and welcome to another Holo and Holochain AMA. This is AMA number 26. Depending on where you are in the world right now, it is May 29th, maybe May 30th. We've got a few people on the call today. I'm Matthew, Director of Communications. I've also got with me David, our Commercial Director for Holo, Mary, our Executive Director for Holo, and PJ, the Product Owner for Holo. I'm going to start with some thank yous. Once again, we'd like to thank our collaborators, contributors, supporters, community builders, partners, and app and platform creators who all share the vision of a more distributed internet. Special thanks to those who are writing, reviewing, and or creating developer and community resources to increase engagement and awareness. We encourage you to learn about Holochain. Please check out developer.holochain.org, where the resources are available to help you build your first Holochain app. Some quick announcements. We have some exciting events and meetups scheduled for the second quarter of 2019. We've got events happening in Perth, Austin, Melbourne, Byron Bay, Sydney, Seattle, London, Switzerland, Amsterdam, and I just heard the other day, there's also one that we don't even have on the list here, in Oklahoma City. Next up, we've got a leadership message from David and Mary. I'll hand it to you.
Sorry, I wasn't ready to unmute myself today. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Nice to be on an AMA. It's been a little while. So we just released a leadership post on our Medium account today. So we shared a little bit of context about how we're progressing. And in particular, we wanted to shed some light on how we work as a team and really give everyone basically some lenses through which maybe you could use to interpret all the different messaging that we put out as a team. And specifically, the post gets into how we operate with agile processes, but yet hold a long-term perspective. We talk about how we approach coordination and org leadership. We talk about how we communicate, how we make commitments, and how we build our business, and finally, how we encourage and enable personal agency with the community. So I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of different threads about all of these things tonight in the way that we're speaking, but the post also shares some specific updates on progress, and I thought I'd jump into a little bit of that before I hand this over to David. In particular, I wanted to say that, Holo has just never been more solid. Our organizational ability to get things done has just really leveled up. And we're addressing the technical and business challenges profoundly at this point. And this is across 10 different countries or countries all over the world and all these different time zones. As a lot of you who follow the communications, specifically in our Dev Pulse, or some of the others know, Holochain is also beginning to build. People are able to build on it now for startups through enterprise. There's more networking and more performance work to be done for sure, and lots of features to be added. But right now you can run apps and people are connecting Holochain nodes today. Closed alpha for Holo is moving forward steadily with each sprint. And we've got an architecture diagram in the post we did today, which I don't know if they're sharing it right now as we're talking. But if you look at that, you can see that we've made tons of progress. And almost everything is in the green now. There's a few places of integrations that we're still finalizing. And we're going to be expanding our closed alpha testing as we continue to validate concurrent nodes communicating across the network. So lots more detail in the article. And then what everybody always wants to know, and I have some latest and greatest news, which is on the holoports. Assembly is complete on holoports and the holoport pluses, which is fantastic. We're running all the units through some additional rounds of quality control. So I know we shared a little bit a while back that we had shipped some number of the earliest units that came off the assembly line to members of the team. And that was part of our quality control process because we've been able to use them in live circumstances and give feedback to the manufacturing and assembly teams. And so that's part of what we're doing now with this last QC process. And as soon as that's done, we'll be preparing the units for shipment to the distributors. So one other quick note, I guess on holoports is that the nano disk image is going to be provided very shortly to the manufacturers. We've got, they're doing some final testing on that, and they'll be sending it off, and that will start moving its way through that process as well. So that's where things are right now. It's pretty exciting. David, do you have anything further you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Just a couple of quick things. One of the reasons that we shared the post in the way that we did was because there was a lot of discussion over the timing and content and other things of the post that Art shared a couple of weeks ago. And for Mary and I, across the executive team and different members of the organisation, we feel it's really important to start to give some keys to be able to decode the holochain organisations and ecosystems. So the post is a way to do that, and to start to show the different roles, different responsibilities, and the different characters, the different personalities, and to get people used to the fact that this is a project that doesn't only have one voice. You know, this is a project that doesn't only have two voices. This is a project that is designed to support the voices of everyone in the organization and the voices of community and ecosystem, ultimately to the voices of the world. You know? And so we hope that this is a nice first step in the never-ending and really beautiful dialogue within people who sit within many of the organization and people who are part of the community, people who are part of different ecosystems that are really close to Holochain, close to Holo, close to the worlds that we're building. Because this is not a unique but a new way of operating. And so we're trying to share and get you connected with the patterns that we're building that we think are better types of organizations, better ways of working, more human ways of working. And that sort of ties into the fourth point that we talked about, which was around our approach to business. It's really wonderful for me when following the messages on Telegram, where you sort of see this tension between why can't you do things? You'd be so much more successful if you lined up these partnerships or these institutions or had these deals done, at the same time as recognizing that the support and the community that we're attempting to foster and the community we're attempting to be in service on is also as a consequence of the business choices that we're making. And so again, what I'd love to invite everyone listening and people who are part of our ecosystem into is the beginnings of conversation around this. You know, if you feel there are partnerships that are important, then let's be part of creating those. And equally, let's be part of understanding the way we are trying to do things so we can work together to create organizations that we think are building off more sustaining and healthy patterns. Hopefully those things give you a little bit of context for why we shared what we shared. And just one other little celebration, which is a really big shout out to the beautiful speech that Moritz gave when he was accepting the Disruptor of the Year award in Malta. What I really loved about his speech was he talked about disruption and also building bridges. You know? And this is so important to our world. We have Holochain, which is an enormous disruptor, and we have Holo, which is building a bridge from where all of us are today into a world that we might imagine in the future. There are many more forms of disruption and bridge building, whether they're social, whether they're within the organization, like Moritz talked about. So just to call out, I think many of you saw the announcement of the award, but a big call out to the speech. And if you can check that out on YouTube, I think you'll enjoy. And let's jump into the questions, I think, now, unless anyone has anything else to share.
I think that's great. All right, first question. Of all the things happening between the Holo and the Holochain projects right now, what excites you the most? I'm going to throw that one actually back to you, David.
Yep, brilliant. And after I answer, if any of you guys have anything burning, please jump in. So there's something we don't talk about enough, and I think we're just going to start founding our voice on this, which is right now the potential for a community of peer-to-peer hosts to connect to different applications, Holochain applications across the world, to build communities with each other, and for the combination of hosts, users, and applications to start to power a new internet. And what that might mean for each of us, that's really starting to excite me. So as Holo gets increasingly built, my level of excitement around the network of connection that can be created is escalating. And then on the holochain perspective, I get really excited around the possibility of social media. There's a lot of conversations in that area at the moment, and how their cost base might change for a social media application, how commercialization possibilities might emerge, how new coordination possibilities might emerge, and how the social and human experience of these kind of applications might change if and when the commercials change around them, and then how this might look for individual agency as we navigate our way through the online world. That's really getting me excited right now.
Thank you, David. All right, next question. We know that one of the reasons, this is the question, we know that one of the reasons Holochain can scale to the levels it does is agent centricity. You aren't validating and holding on to everyone's data. Is this, am I reading this right? Or is this for Mary? Let me see. Yeah, I think this is the question. Okay. We know that one of the reasons Holochain can scale to the levels it does is because of its agent centricity. You aren't validating and holding on to everyone's data like you would in blockchain, just what's applicable to you. Well, that's part right. That being said, to what degree are agent or personal chains able to be seen or audited by a third party? In other words, let's say I wanted to prove to Jane that Harry and I have been transacting for the past 6 months and have done X, Y, Z. What options will be available to show Jane our history? I guess I'm looking for any kind of similarity between a global visibility and auditability of traditional blockchain distributed ledger technologies and Holochain. Thanks. All right, I'm going to throw this one to Mary. Mary?
All right, well, I'll take a part of it at least and take a stab here. So, and I'm going to jump around a little bit. So in the case of HoloFuel, when every time you transact with somebody, they're auditing your chain and you're auditing theirs. And by the way, I'm starting with HoloFuel because this is an application. This is a Holochain application enabled on Holo that we're creating. That means we designed what all the validations are. Some of them are standard validations that are built into Holochain, and others are validations that we've decided are important for the app. So that's why this may go a couple of different ways. But anyway, at a Holochain level, every time you transact with somebody, they're going to audit your chain, you're going to audit theirs. That's how each person knows that the other is a valid agent. Now, what is seen can depend a lot on how that app is built. So the validation is not based really on any content you may be sharing. If, for example, the app is a chat app and you're sending a message, it isn't that the message is visible from one person to the other. It's that that each person can see that the previous transactions were valid in each chain, and that the chains are valid to be continuing to work in the application according to the rules of the application. So from a technical perspective, the data in the DHT is public to the users of the app that are inside the membrane or community, and visibility to it will most likely depend on the app UI or somebody's technical capability, basically. Private data, on the other hand, on a chain will never be visible to others. But if the data is unencrypted and shared to the DHT, it can be inspected by any other app participants. So it gets a little tricky there. Matt, do you want to add a little bit more and get into some of the what they were getting at, Jane and Harry?
Sure. So in that case of trying to prove to Jane that you and Harry have been interacting, right? The key piece of evidence that you would present to Jane are the actions that Harry has taken with you that have been signed by Harry, specifically using Harry's private key that Harry doesn't share with anybody else, right? Those actions, those signed actions, may be available in an app like HoloFuel, like the HoloFuel app, simply because those signatures are stored on your own source chain. That's part of this kind of counter signing of chains is part of that particular app. Other apps could use that pattern as well, though not all will. In other apps that don't use that countersigning sort of practice, you might not be holding on to their signed action in your source chain, but you can point Jane to the hash address, basically the location, where she can find those signed actions in the shared storage, right? The distributed hash table for that application, which is being run on the devices of the participants of that app. Unfortunately, if you aren't familiar with the basics of cryptography, this stuff can sound really abstract really fast. For those interested in a primer on some of the basic tools and techniques in cryptography, I actually have a post on that on my personal blog, which I almost never post to any longer, that covers a bit of this. I wrote that post before we even started coding Holochain, and it isn't about Holochain specifically, but it might make some of the building blocks of cryptography a bit more accessible. And we'll drop those links into the live stream chat.
Right. And I just wanted to say one other quick thing, because even Matt, in your description there's this, you can send somebody to the hash. Well, sure. But the way most of us think of applications is through a user interface. And so a lot of how many people will experience this is through whatever the user interface has enabled. And that may not be as easy as sending somebody to show that there was this transaction. It really depends on what gets designed. Applications can be complex.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Each application will have its own sort of design, and we're talking about back-end things here, about how something is stored, where it's stored, how it's validated, how it's served, how it's looked up, and what button you push is going to be very different. Okay, depending on the particular app. Next question, what does validation before adding a new entry to local chain, so validation before adding a new entry to local chain, mean exactly? Does it mean the custom validation in Zome, or are there other holochain validation rules running besides signing the body of content? PJ, can you take this one?
Sure, yeah, with a pleasure. So basically, DNA is a code, and this code includes validation functions. The validation functions are run each time an entry is published to DHT or your source chain, or it's also run whenever the node receives the entry for storing. They can be simple functions like return true or false, or they can be very complex. They actually describe the whole business logic of the hub, and because DNA is hashed, each time the node is running the validation functions, each node also knows that they're running the same validation functions, right? So that allows for creating the network of trust. So yes, the validation function is specific to the Zome, to the piece inside DNA and the execution layer. That gives us a huge flexibility on designing the logic of a hub. We can have strong validation rules. We can have no validation rules and data just propagating across the DHT. And that all depends on the designer of a hub. There's also a layer of, it's not the validation, but there's also a layer of control over data on the DHT level, where the data is distributed over the network. And on that level, the nodes make sure that there is a proper redundancy level maintained across the network to store the data. But to answer the question, the validation before adding a new entry to a local chain is the validation inside of the Zome code.
And I'll just add a little bit more to that. The basic idea here is, hey, we've all agreed to run some set of rules. I actually check those rules first, my machine does, before allowing me to take an action. And in part, that's so that I don't step on other people's toes, right? If we're running some app that says 140 characters or less, that's what we're doing here. My app checks that the message I'm trying to add is actually 140 characters or less before it signs it onto the local chain and then starts propagating to the others. Those others then start checking, again, that same rule set and deciding for themselves, does this follow the rules or not? But that validation before adding a new entry is about sort of checking your own actions to make sure you're playing by the rules before before we do other stuff. Okay, next up, what does validation in holohost DHT mean? So this is kind of the related part. Are they running the same validations as a local HAP, or are there some other validations? If I tampered with my local chain by changing and signing all the blocks, how does the DHT recognize the problem? So this is, I'll go ahead and continue the riff that I just started. This question seems to be coming from a point of confusion that is very common. There is no one big holo chain. I'm going to repeat that. There is no one big holo chain, okay? Unlike Ethereum or most other blockchains, there isn't one big platform where all actions are recorded, validated, and served. Each holochain app is its own separate social space with its own members, its own set of membership criteria, its own validation rules, and its own computing capacity using the storage and processing power of the participants themselves. Validation generally refers to checking the HAP rules against the piece of content being validated. That could be as simple as, is it signed by who it claims to have been signed by? A bit more complex things such as, is the message a text-only message that's more than 140 characters? Or even more complex, requiring the validator to make requests for information from other nodes in the app to help determine whether the author is in a state that qualifies them to take a particular action. So for instance, do they possess an account balance that would enable them to spend some holo fuel? This validation is done first by the party taking the action, right? So if I'm trying to spend some holo fuel, I first check this stuff and go, yep, I'm in the right state. But then when it's shared with the rest of the distributed hash table, right, the shared storage for that specific application, it is propagated to other participants, each of which is responsible for independently checking the content to see that it is valid. And then after they've done so, they sign a statement indicating that they, as a participant in that app, vouch that it is valid. Or instead, that they vouch that it violates the rules of the app in some way and is instead rejected. Now to be clear, this is not them doing this as a person. This is their device doing this in an automated way on their behalf, checking the rules, etc. But that's the process. Now, unless you have access to the private keys of all the other parties that are either taking actions or validating your actions, you won't be able to forge their signatures. In practice, it should be difficult to gain access to even one other party's private keys. To gain access to all of them wouldn't just undermine a holochain app, it would undermine the functioning of any cryptography-based system, not just the world of cryptocurrencies, but just about all computer security systems more generally. So that's not a particular attack vector that we're very concerned about. I think I'll leave my comments there. Does anybody else want to add anything?
Well, maybe one comment that I have is that because we are capable of writing the logic of the applications into the zones, we can, for example, extend the concept of immutable storage. We know that blockchain is an immutable storage, but inside of our code, we can say that the storage will be immutable, except when all the validators agree that we can mark an entry as deleted, or we can alter them, right? So we are making an agreement across all the nodes operating on the network that we're going to play by certain rules. And it allows us to extend the concept of this agreement, which in case of blockchain is so stiff. That's my comment.
Awesome. All right, next up. Is the DHT, again, that's the distributed hash table, our shared storage for a particular app. Is the DHT merging all chains for one DNA or one person, or could we have different sets of chains? Assume I installed a HAP, created the first chain, then deleted all data. Then I either install the HAP again, or install it on another device with one key pair. Can somebody comment on that? PJ, maybe can you comment on that?
Sure, yeah. So DHT stores only public entries. Source chain can store public or private entries. Public entries are the ones that I decide to publish to DHT. Private ones are the ones that I decide to keep for myself. They never get published to the DHT. In our model of security, we recommend using different key pair, private and public key, for each instance of a source chain, which means for each device we use a different key and manage keys under the deep key application. So depending on whether you are posting private entries to your source chain or not, you can either recreate the source chain from DHT or not, because obviously if you had there are a lot of some private entries, they would never get published to DHT. So this recreation of your source chain would not be possible. The only 100% bulletproof way for protecting your source chain from being lost is with help of encrypted backups HAP that makes sure your data is redundantly duplicated across your devices. And as a Holo and Holochain, we're building this backup hub for users of Holo and Holochain.
Wonderful, thank you. I've got a little bit of a loud bystanders where I'm at, so I'm moving locations. This is me operating on the road, folks. I actually want to make one other reminder for folks who aren't super familiar with all the intricacies of the technical stuff in Holochain. The DHT is, again, the shared storage running across the community, and the source chain is the local storage. So on your device, if I am running Twitter, when I tweet, it gets stored first on my local source chain on my device, typically on my device, and then is backed up in the distributed hash table in the shared storage. So there are backups which make that content then available to others, regardless of whether or not I happen to be online at any particular moment. All right, next up. Could you go into a little more detail about the permissionlessness of Holochain? What would I be able to do without submitting any KYC? Would I be able to view, use, deploy, or host any Holochain apps or HAPs? If so, how would HAPs like Junto handle content of violence or pornography? Will HAPs such as Junto really be censorship resistant? Mary, do you want to take this on?
Yeah, definitely. And I want to start actually by repeating what Matt said earlier. There's no one big Holochain. I love that sentence. So when you ask about permissionless use of apps, you're first really asking all the different creators of the apps. Not all of those Holochain apps will be hosted on Holo. Now, in the example question that you gave, those probably will be. But let me start a little bit higher. So use of Holochain or any Holochain app without Holo doesn't require KYC from us. It's a distributed application used in a distributed way, unless the creator of the app itself requires it, and we don't have any say about that. Being a user of a Holochain app through Holo will at minimum require an email address for your login. So that's just because you have to set up your key pairs with something, and we're starting with email address. So hosting is a little bit different, or being an app provider. Those people make distributed apps available to other users via the web browser, and that's going to require, both of those roles are going to require more significant identity verification, because what you're doing is you're getting into a contract with Holo, and Holo, as we've been talking about, we're bridging the decentralized world to the centralized world, and so we have to deal with the regular sorts of things that centralized businesses deal with, which is knowing your customer and all those other snarly little issues, like knowing that we're transacting currency, money, using real bank accounts and those things, and that's part of why we're existing. We're trying to bridge the capacity in a marketplace for people to take something that's been created to work in a decentralized space and make it available to people who are on the internet today. But the reality is that we can't speak to how each app will manage content within their app. So when you get to the section of how whether or not they're going to allow violence, pornography, and all those different things, that's up to the app creator. And remember, these apps can be used in multiple modalities at the same time. So some of them may be intended to be completely distributed. Others may be intended to be, used on Holo. And so they may make different decisions for different types of apps. And also to kind of call this out, when an app provider puts an app on Holo, they have to describe what kind of application it is and what kind of content will be in it potentially. And that's so that the people who are hosting can also make decisions about what they want to host, what risks they want to take. So we're not making those decisions for anybody.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate something that Mary said early on, because we also went into a bunch of detail about Holo in particular. Holo chain, no KYC needed as a general rule for Holo chain, right? It's not a platform, it's a pattern. Any two computers that want to make use of that pattern can. It's just a way for them to enforce rules amongst themselves, right? For them to be able to share storage, validation, serve, essentially be able to run applications in sort of the way we do today, but without having to have web servers in the middle. And so it's a pattern that enables that, not a platform. Okay, next question. And I'm in a Starbucks now, so it's even louder than probably was before. To what degree will the dynamic feature of HoloFuel affect its ability to grow? I believe I understand that HoloFuel is meant to remain relatively stable, but will the dynamic aspect of it impede its value, or merely make it so that it isn't extremely volatile, but still expands in value? David, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And love the questions about HoloFuel. Good to see one on the AMA today. So firstly, just want to get us thinking about the purpose of the currency of HoloFuel. And the purpose of the currency is to incentivize the ecosystem of distributed hosting, incentivize hosts chain applications via Holo. So what this dynamic supply feature, instead of going to the technical side of things, why is dynamic supply important? So when demand changes, for example, there's lots of applications that want hosting and not enough hosts, or there are lots of people who want to ride a taxi home and not enough taxis, what you want is an environment where as quickly as possible, the supply changes to meet that demand. If you have an environment where you're fixing the supply, then what you're going to do is dramatically change the price to meet that demand. And that means you're going to price a whole bunch of participants out of the market. We don't want to price hosts out of the hosting market. We don't want to price applications out of the hosting market and therefore limit the number or amount of applications being hosted in the distributed hosting world. What we want is demand increases, not enough supply, more hosts into the market. So the design of HoloFuel is to incentivize hosts to participate in this economy in the same way. So this is part of the beauty of the design of HoloFuel is it is incentivizing value creation or value-adding activity on the network, which is the participation of hosts. So as simplest, as the network of hosts grows and HoloFuel is increasingly used and Holo as a hosting business starts to take a share of the hosting market, then the overall value of HoloFuel will begin to represent more and more of the value of the hosting market. So I think we can start to see where the potential value could be, but the value is in the economic and social activity created by the hosts, not in the system of money.
Thank you, David. All right, next question. I know that you can swap HoloFuel for hot and then for fiat if the HoloFuel was earned inside the ecosystem. But will you be able to swap HoloFuel derived from the one-to-one hot token swap? Mary, can you take this?
Yep, I'll take this one. So no, any HoloFuel you swap to can be transacted with by paying for hosting or sending to another person who's agreed to receive it. But within the Holo platform, only hosts can redeem HoloFuel earned from hosting. That means you have valid service logs as proof of providing a service, and you'll redeem it for whatever currency is in one of the reserves that we have. Now, anybody can go to an exchange if an exchange has holofuel listed and trade out there. That has nothing to do with how the internal system of Holo works and what we're doing in terms of redemption.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary. Keeping it short and sweet and clear. I love it. All right. So next up, how is it possible for holofuel and hot holders to profit when devs will self-host and undercut normal hosts? Why would a dev pay a stranger when they can pay themselves /family/friends? Holo is only interested in the 1% transaction fees, not holders of hot or holofuel. Okay, Mary, can you take this one too?
Sure. Okay, so sure, a dev can self-host. Well, they probably will. But any dev that wants a resilient application available to regular users of the internet would not want to limit their hosting to themselves. I mean, this is the same reason why people don't self-host in a box sitting underneath their desk at home. You know, on the internet, you don't have the ability to provide consistency of the application availability to people that want to access it. You can't scale, those sorts of things. So the way that applications will be matched with hosts will be based on algorithms. A host will be able to see the apps, but the app provider, and in this case, in this example, this question, the developer of it as well, they're not going to be able to select people by name to host. They're going to configure a set of requirements. They're going to say what kind of processing speed they need, what jurisdiction their application is allowed in, how much bandwidth would be useful for hosting, because maybe they have video on their app, or maybe it's just a simple text chat. Maybe their storage needs are extremely high. Based on all of that criteria, apps will be matched with hosts that make those services available. Not every host will have the same capacity. There's also going to be categories of apps. I mean, we talked earlier about, in the example where somebody asked about a social media site, and that content may be different. Maybe you have a dating site. Maybe somebody doesn't like the idea of hosting a dating site. I don't want any dating sites. We don't have every category defined at this stage, but we have general categories that we're starting out with, and those will probably shift and evolve as we continue. But basically, hosts will be able to select the kinds of apps that they want to host, and app providers will be able to describe the sort of apps that they have, and then they'll be matched together.
Okay, next up. With the Orion announcement, it's being asked if holofuel will be tradable on their platform. Does Holo have an answer to this question?
Mary? Yeah, I guess this one as well. So I'm guessing that first of all, any announcements on trading holofuel are going to come from the leadership post, and we would make announcements on AMAs. And first of all, that can't happen until after the Holo mainnet. So we're not making any commitments about holofuel. We're not even at a test net for that yet fully. We will maintain a build first strategy. And by the way, I would just maybe assume that applications or other groups out there that are describing or mentioning holofuel, they may mean hot. I'm not certain.
Yeah, just jump in and firstly, thanks so much to it's really amazing to watch the way that the community will jump in and ask these clarifying questions and work to find truth in different statements. So just a big shout out to everyone who's involved in reading this announcement and checking and validating and asking questions. Second is, it's not just in what Mary and I shared at the start of this AMA, where you can hear different voices from different members of the organization, different members of the community. It's actually that there are at times conflicting messages sent from applications. The breadth and the complexity of what we're building means that sometimes that the language isn't what exactly you're looking for, it isn't perfect. There could be some dissonance there. And again, it's amazing to see the way the community picks that up. And at the same time, it's also very valuable for us to know what's clear and what's not clear. So we see this as a really effective signaling mechanism to see, okay, when there's dissonance or discord amongst certain messages from certain applications, around specifics. Could be holofuel, could be the difference between holo and holochain. We often see in different papers or articles holo and holochain confused or interchangeable. Then it's also a good sign for us to make sure that we're clarifying, simplifying our communications, and also helping different applications and members of the ecosystem see clearly these various differences. So yeah, huge kudos and thanks to everyone who's picked that up, and hopefully Mary's post was clear. And we're trying to also at the start signal where you might look to get some of these official announcements. So if you're in the community, you can feel safe that you're not suddenly going to find out a particular application or partnership or something has this exclusive use to holofuel that you haven't heard before. You'll hear about the way holofuel is going to be released through the leadership posts, through the emerging cloud posts, and through the AMAs. And so this is a really nice feedback loop to test that pattern.
Wonderful. Okay, next up. What are the advantages of developers self-hosting, and what are the disadvantages? I'm actually going to throw this one back to Mary again, because she was kind of just commenting on that.
Right. This totally links back to what I was just describing. I think what I didn't say previously is that when you're hosting your own app, you're also going to be able to evaluate probably better the needs that your app has. As we said, you're describing what you require in hosts when you set up your app as an app provider. But you may find in hosting your app that it doesn't necessarily need as much bandwidth or storage as you might have guessed. Those things could be changed. So if you're hosting your own app, you'll actually get a feedback loop with valuable information that may come back to you about how your app functions on the network. But to be the only person hosting your app, it's just super risky. It's not resilient. Why would you do that? If you really want it to be accessible to people, you don't want to have it hosted in one place anyway. That's the point of having a distributed network, where it can be in many places, and people will have slower or less latency in reaching your application if it's distributed across different geographical regions as well. Now, if it's only an app for a small rural community, you may care less, but you may have 5 people in your community to host it instead of 1, and then you'll have more resilience. So I think it really comes back to what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and how much your reach is, and how does it fit your needs.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. All right, next up. When Holochain and Scepter take over the world and people are able to understand what's going on in the supply chain, why should they care? It's a genius idea for shifting the regulatory burden, but I'm afraid that many people just might not care about pollution, deforestation, etc. All right, I'm going to go ahead and try to take this one on. So to unpack what the question is a touch, when I go today to buy a pair of sunglasses, let's say at a grocery store or a cup of coffee at a Starbucks, I'm not able to see very far into that supply chain. Now that's changed a little bit in recent decades. We now have things like fair trade certification, certified organic. Those are little signals that are letting us see a little bit into a supply chain, but not very much, right? We're able to maybe see 1, 2 layers deep, maybe in one particular dimension, right? Did they use pesticides? Did they pay their employees a fair wage? But our ability to see deeply into supply chains in all the myriad ways that might matter to us as individuals or us as communities, that's just not in existence today. And for me, this is actually some of the stuff that I get most excited about with Holochain. The question that they jump to in the prompt is, but what if people don't care? And that's a really important question. My hunch is if people don't care, then the result will be pain, right? Pain in terms of collapsing ecologies, pain in terms of lost jobs, pain all over the place. And once people start to experience pain, it's funny how quickly they start to care. But pain is actually a really important part of the feedback loop in life in general. And I think that what happens in I'm gonna sort of take a slight left here. I'm gonna touch on artificial intelligence, automation, and jobs. Right? There has been a lot of concern in recent years about AI and automation, leading to there being no more jobs, right? Nobody needing to do anything any longer. Those concerns we've been talking about pretty constantly as a society over the last few years, but they're not new. Those same concerns have been getting expressed for at least 150 years, if not more. When electrification first came along, similar fears showed up. And yet that's not what happened. We never got to a world with no work. Because at some level, economics is not about jobs. Jobs is a particular way of doing economics. Economics is about priorities. It's about helping people sense and prioritize how they're going to spend their time as individuals and how we should spend our time as a community. We are going to continue to need to prioritize how we spend our time. What automation has tended to do in the past, and what I think it will continue doing in the future, is shifting what it is that we can be sensitive to. 150 years ago, before the rise of electricity broadly, before the invention of the vacuum cleaner and the washing machine and the washer and dryer and all of these things, the dishwasher, before the rise of the chemicals industry, what a clean house looked like was very different from what a clean house looks like today. Right? If you walked into a home 150 years ago and saw a home that looked like today, you would go, wow, these people must have 1,000 slaves or something, right? They must be kings to live with something that is this dust-free, clean, etc. But what happened was with the shift in capacity, we increased our sensitivity. Our sense of what was good enough, clean enough, organized enough, changed over time. And my belief with the supply chains is that will happen as well. That when you show up at a party wearing jeans that 3 layers deep relied upon slaves, and people can see that with just a click of a button, and you could see that with just a click of a button. What happens is when you show up at that party, other people look at you and go, slaver? Right? It's not that you are someone who is wearing jeans that happen to have been made by somebody who was a slave. It's that you are somebody who makes use of slaves. Your capacity to have chosen differently actually results in responsibility. It gives you an ability to respond. And as communities, we tend to then hold ourselves responsible. It's not a given, right? People are going to prioritize what we care about, what we don't care about. Those are going to shift over time. But if we are able to increase capacity for sensing and interpreting of information in the way that we are envisioning this becoming possible, that's what that regulatory burden shift in the question was referring to. It's a shift from us having the government figure out how young is too young, how little is too little for paying somebody, etc., to each of us having both having the capacity to sense what our choices are, right? Do I choose A or B? And then also having the capacity to sense who am I hoping to interact with and what do they care about and what do I care about? That's the shift in regulatory burden, but it comes about from a radical increase in sense-making capacity. All right, I've ranted for a while.
Okay.
Anybody else have thoughts?
I do. I really want to talk a little bit about this. So I think that it's really important to, the words are written here, regulatory burden. And I don't think all companies relate to everything regulatory as burden, for one thing. Some of it is that they want to do good. We can't write off all companies, all people as not caring. I understand having fears because we look out in the world and we see these arguments about whether or not there is climate change happening. But we also look out and see things like the Paris Accords, where most everybody did come to an agreement that there is a problem that we want to solve for. I think there is a lot of goodwill and a lot of people and organizations saying good work must be done and that they do care. And I think part of why regulatory burden increases over time is because many of those same people are saying, we must require this of each other. And we may not like that it happens in certain governmental agencies. We may not like the mechanisms by which this is going on, But those are demonstrations of us caring as communities. And I think it is only increased over time, and I think it will continue to increase. Since I've been in business, however many decades, there's just been a growing conversation about the ethics of doing business. And I think that's brilliant. And I think that, you know, each year it becomes deeper. And so when we talk about supply chains, you know, in the 90s, I don't remember conversations that dealt with slave labor in supply chains. Maybe they existed, but they weren't mainstream. Those conversations are mainstream today. That makes a huge difference. And the more that we can provide visibility into those things, the more that we can set our brands out as not doing that, or is doing something far more to make good in the world, the better. And I think it's just going to continue in that direction. So maybe that's my dreamer side showing up over my practical side.
Yeah, I just love it. I want to just sort of add to that, which is the one last point that I want to make is to do with caretaking, right? That at some level, with increased capacity, we become better at being able to caretake with one another individually and collectively, and that feels totally critical. The other piece related to that has to do with change and how scary change can be. Right? I think it's becoming pretty obvious, completely separate from Holo and Holochain. It's becoming pretty obvious that the existing institutions are having a really hard time handling the world as it's showing up. And so we're seeing collapses of ecology, of political systems, you know, across the board. And that's scary. And change in general can be scary, but it isn't always scary. I was having a conversation with my friend and colleague Nora Bateson the other day. We were talking about this topic of change, and it was sort of, you know, how do we know that we've got to go through this change? How do we do it in a way that isn't deeply frightening for all those involved? And the thing that showed up in that conversation was, it's not about change that's being forced upon you is scary. Change that you are choosing, you're going, ooh, I could move towards this, is a lot less scary. And Nora's comment on that was, nobody mourns the death of the landline. Maybe AT&T, right? But nobody else, right? Because we all picked up cell phones because they were just so much more useful. Now we've had other things that have shown up that's not so great with, you know, cell phones being so ubiquitous in our lives. But the loss of the landline was not something that we went, oh no, the sky is falling about. So change can happen, and radical change can happen. But it has to be change that is anchored in our agency and our capacity to navigate on an ongoing basis. I'll leave it there. Let's see, what else? Next up. Can we see what a HAP, a holographic app or a holochain app, pays for hosting? PJ, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'll go down to the technical weeds after such a high conversation you guys had. Going back to reality. It was great to listen to that. So yeah, well, the HAP won't pay because it's the agent-centric architecture. So it will be the HAP provider paying, obviously, right? And each HAP provider is built by the host via service logs. If you take a look at the article, there's a diagram, technical diagram. There are so-called service logs. Those are the services that are logging each request from internet to the host. And based on those requests, they create invoices where the host would bill provider for services provided. And obviously, there's going to be, there actually already is the interface where you can go through the invoices received from hosts and see what is the total you've paid for hosting over an extended amount of time. And also aggregate those. So the HAP providers are going to have quite a good visibility into what is the cost of hosting distributed HAPs on Holo. Anybody wants to add anything?
Yep. So, yep, thanks. So it's really interesting. We use a lot of terms here, and it can get really confusing. And in particular, we're talking about developers developing holochain applications, and then we have this other term that we use that's called an application provider or HAP provider. And I think it's really important for our community to understand the difference. So when somebody develops an application and it's going to be going through a process that other developers in the community have to validate to make sure that it's good, that it does what it says it's going to do, that at a technical level it works. And there's going to be, I don't know all the rules involved in that. At some point we'll get into describing it. But once that's done, it will be then available as a distributed application on an app store. Okay, so now we have holochain apps available on an app store. These are completely distributed. They have nothing to do with Holo. Now then, if somebody takes one of those distributed applications and says, hey, this is an open source application perhaps, and I'd like to make it available to a community in particular, or I'd like to make a version of this or an instance of it available to on the internet, they take that and they pay for the hosting of that application on Holo. So that's why we have different distinctions and different terms. And because we're really working with an open source community where people can use these things in ways that they want to, oftentimes, not all of them will be open source necessarily or available for anybody to do that, but many, many, many of them will. That's the intention.
Wonderful. All right, next up. This comment says, AWS, that's Amazon Web Services, Amazon's web hosting business, basically, for those at home. AWS could wipe Holochain AWS, I think what they're referring to there is Holo, market out with one tweet if they said they are going to run Amazon distributed hosting and have their own ports, and hosts can earn credit at Amazon store or redeem it for US dollars. Okay, so that sounds like they're conjecturing that that's the case. So I'll throw that to you as sort of a prompt. What do you think, David?
Firstly, I'm not sure how Amazon would be able to run a distributed hosting network like Holo could run. I think that what's really interesting comes down to this idea of trust. And Holochain and Holo are designed to extend trust and move it from what is owned within organization silos, be able to have trust be extended to people working in different networks, connecting, sharing information in different ways. And at the heart, I can't see how an Amazon-owned system will be able to handle the required extension of trust to build the distributed hosting network that we know there are so many of you listening now in our ecosystem and in our community that desperately are looking for.
Yeah, they've solved a different problem, which is they keep everything behind their walls. They would have to flip their thinking inside out and start solving the kinds of problems we're solving in order to actually pull off a distributed hosting system. So if they do that, and it is very similar to Holo, I guess that would be a way that Holochain or Holo have achieved dominance through an unusual path. But I don't see their financial incentives aligned with that. That feels like them. Companies tend to have a really hard time disrupting themselves and throwing away multi-billion-dollar revenue streams. There's a wonderful book by Clayton Christensen, or series of books by Clayton Christensen about that issue, the innovator's dilemma, etc. Go check it out if you're interested. Okay, next up. If HoloPort fails, does it affect other projects? David, you want to take this one as well?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. I'll keep it short and sweet because we're close to time, but we're trying to build a really resilient ecosystem. Although the ecosystem does have building blocks. So for Holo to succeed, we need Holochain. And for Holo Fuel to succeed, we need Holo. For Holo ports is a really interesting one. So it's an important piece of infrastructure, but not a crucial piece of infrastructure for the success of the ecosystem. For example, we could have, as PJ mentioned, I think earlier, People could be running virtual machines. We can have different types of ports in the market. There are all sorts of things that can happen as community and hosting community and broader community starts to begin to participate and interact in this Holo ecosystem. So yes, we need Holochain as a foundational block and great progress there. In terms of the holoports, it's really important, and you can see from the post Mary shared at the start that all sorts of efforts in quality assurance and other testing are in place to make sure that ports are as loved and successful as we know they can be. We really are trying to build a resilient, integrated ecosystem that is powered by our community. So if something goes wrong, we know that there's going to be a group of people that are going to pick up and make it better.
Yep. And just one last thing on top of that, David, I just really want people to really understand with holoports. It's the OS that's critical. The operating system on the holoport is what's running Holo. And the Holo software, the holoport software is really the gem. And really, it's not like we're not building an ecosystem like Apple did with, control of hardware. The idea is that this will evolve, and it may be used in many, many, many different ways, and other people will add to it from where we're starting today. We don't want to be in control of the hardware by any stretch, and we want to enable more and more people in our community to be part of the creators of what we're building. So thanks everybody for joining us on the AMA.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, I'm Matthew. This is Mary. We also had with us David and PJ. Thank you to Micah, Amanda, the rest of the Holochain and Holo teams that have helped put this together. And special thanks, as always, to those of you who are writing, reviewing, and creating developer and community resources to increase engagement and awareness.
And a few shout outs to old former team members out there who are helping us answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care. Until next time.